Funny old region, the South. Impressively large, but not possessed of much of an identity of its own. Perhaps that's because it's a natural habitat of the middle class, which would tend toward a certain blandness of character. Maybe not. Maybe I don't know what I'm talking about. What am I, George Monbiot? Anyway, something the South shares with its counterparts to the West, by which I mean my region, as seen way back in episode 1, is an inability to keep hold of an ITV station. The South East and the South West are, to my knowledge, the only regions for which the ITV channel changed hands with almost every major franchise round, discounting 1974 when nothing happened whatsoever. Unlike my region, however, the likes of Kent and Surrey are full of people who actually matter, and so they got their start in 1958, just 3 years into ITV's existence. The company that won the franchise was the aptly named Southern, a joint venture between Associated Newspapers, the Rank organisation, and of all people DC Thomson and Company, the Scottish publishing house best known for the Beano and the Dandy, although Southern Television would turn out to have a lot less in common with those than with its stablemate, the People's Friend. There was a slight hitch before they'd even started broadcasting, as Associated Newspapers also had a stake in Rediffusion, the London franchise holders, and the ITA didn't want a single company to have its fingers in more than one ITV franchise because of the whole integrity thing that was still considered quite important at the time. So Associated Newspapers were told they'd have to sell one or the other interest, and they chose to stick with Southern. Incidentally, Associated, now known as DMG Media, was and is the company behind the Daily Mail. Again, this would inform the turn of the station. So anyway, on the 30th of August 1958, people in Middlesex got to see animated adverts for Murray Mints for the very first time, as Southern Independent Television, to give it its highfalutin full name, started broadcasting. The initial ident was a silent, looming Art Deco piece with disturbing Freudian undertones. You could have someone's eye out with that. The clouded background and Clarice Cliff foo-for-all wouldn't last, but the star, along with the more Alexandra Palace and Thou attitude, would remain with the station for the rest of its existence. The first change came only a few years later, in 1961 or so, as the star regenerated into its more familiar line drawing form, and gained what I suppose qualifies as a jingle, albeit the most forbidding jingle in ITV's history, Yorkshire and ABC included. Perhaps recognising that being vaguely threatening wasn't the way to go, Southern first went all the way to the other extreme with a jingle that sounded like it was being played by Dick Van Dyke's one-man band in Mary Poppins. This was altogether too busy, not to mention common. Southern's keyword was always class. Their image had to be tasteful. They finally corrected it when they contacted Simon Race to provide the trademark 8 notes on a slightly out-of-tune guitar jingle, which, alongside the star and the slogan, "The station that serves the South," finally gave Southern its own definitive identity. That last note is optional, and as tended to be the case in those days, especially for stations like Southern for whom classiness was key, this remained pretty much unchanged for the rest of the station's broadcasting life. The arrival of colour in 1969 saw the backdrop change from black to blue, also a common occurrence in those days, but apart from that the ident pretty much remained as you were and untouched for nearly 2 decades. Of course, these were the days when the ident represented only half of the channel's presentation. The days when most people watching ITV got to see their programmes being introduced by real people, with real human faces and noses and presumably bums. Southern's humans included Christopher Robbie, seen here in the classic Doctor Who story The Mind Robber as the Carcass, who, according to the story, is a newspaper superhero we should all be reading about right now. Yeah, well, something hoverboards. He was also the very first cyber leader in the somewhat less well-regarded Revenge of the Cybermen. Later actors in the role would turn down the homosexual undertones. There was also Brian Nissen, the ultimate example of the white man in a suit continuity announcer archetype, and I don't mean that in any kind of derogatory sense whatsoever. Nissen was smooth, unflappable, and gifted with the kind of voice that could make the Jim Davidson show seem worth watching, if not actually classy.
Jim Davidson and his friends, and the topic of Jim's show this week is leisure and entertainment.
Nissen and Robbie were very much the king and crown prince of Southern television, lording it over the likes of Bill Flynn, a man so posh as to make you genuinely wonder if he's not a minor royal slumming it out of politeness.
Look forward to this afternoon as well. At 20 to 5, Emu is holding a Christmas party, and at 5:45, the Muppets. But right now, it's time for a program which may have been made about me.
The adorable freelancer Verity Martindale,
Unusual attempt to preserve Kenyan wildlife. We'll be going out of town with Jack Hargreaves at 11.
and of course, your Uncle Frank, taking time out from his usual job as the manager of the local branch of Midland Bank. The other inescapable face belonged to Fred Dinage, newsreader and utility bald man who became known to the nation at large through the Did You Know kids show How, and its later revival. His daughter is now a cabinet minister, but we won't hold that against him. And in this way, Southern ploughed its upper-middle-class Tory furrow quite comfortably for 22 years. 2 franchise reviews came and went, both proving largely of interest to the rubber stamp manufacturing industry, although the 1968 one did make a couple of changes, which we'll hear about in later episodes. Then 1980 came along. Another franchise review and another opportunity for the ITV network to refresh itself. The ITA was now the IBA, and the structure was modernised. Several franchises were subdivided for efficiency. Breakfast television was invented, we've seen how that went. And the Bluebell Hill transmitter, which had belonged to and transmitted Thames Television, was given to the newly subdivided South East region instead. Oh, and Southern Television was sentenced to death. The 1980 franchise round was the last to be conducted as a job application rather than an auction. Everyone was invited to submit a package detailing their plans and why they should be picked, and Southern, as incumbents, were confident. Incredibly confident. Insanely, smugly, complacently confident. Because their application ran to a mere 16 pages, all of which apparently promised to change absolutely nothing whatsoever in any way, shape or form. If it ain't broke, don't fix it is one thing. But obviously it ain't broke, how could you possibly conceive of such a thing, just get out the rubber stamp and we can get to the clubhouse before teeing off time, is quite another. And to the IBA's ears this sounded unmistakably like the stuffed shirts behind Southern were saying the latter. In contrast, the winning consortium had an application packed full of fresh and modern plans which may not all have been feasible, but were certainly exciting. Part of Southern's downfall was underestimating their own region. With the rise of the yuppie and dozens of new companies incorporating themselves in Kent and Berkshire, the south of England would be a very different place by the end of the 80s. Some people were perceiving this change already, including many at the IBA, and more importantly, Southern's competitors for the franchise. But Southern themselves, or at least the people behind it, seemed to be blissfully unaware of the possibility that out of town might become less than pertinent to their locale by the year 1990. But then again, very few of them actually were from the south of England. Hell, DC Thomson was still major partners, and they were based in Dundee. There was very little local flavour in the company itself. And of course the same could have been said of someone like the originally London-based Granada. But once they'd got the northern region, the Bernsteins sweated blood to do it justice, until their completely arbitrary company name became synonymous with the north of England. Southern's owners? I don't want to give the impression that Southern had no interest whatsoever in their region. The station was a great servant to its local area from factory floor level. But the money men behind it had a more, let's say, Carlton attitude. Very few of them had even seen Kent. The IBA, having balls in those days, took a dim view of this, and given the perfunctory nature of the application and the paucity of new ideas, decided instead to give the licence to the up-and-coming new guys with actual plans for the future.
Here we go. Where are you now? 2, 3, 4, go.
As far as Southern executives were concerned, this was the single greatest act of betrayal in human history. They burned with the white-hot fury of 1,000 suns. The IBA shrugged and said the other guys made a better case. Or any case at all. They invited Southern to reapply and this time bothered to explain what they were actually going to do. But they didn't. Instead, they sat in their cells on death row, slowly marinating in their rich, creamy sense of betrayal. When Christmas 1981 rolled around, if you lived in Surrey and only watched ITV, you might have come away with the impression that the world was going to end on New Year's Day. The continuity booth was now decorated with what amounted to their own headstone. They were displaying their date of death across the channel like condemned men. And in case that was too subtle, they made sure to never miss an opportunity to verbally remind the viewers of their impending demise. The stations, that is, not the viewers. Although, as I said, you might very well have come away with the impression that they were one and the same. And the executives behind Southern probably would have been okay with that.
I'm sure you know that today is the very last day of Southern Television's transmission, so it's time now for the last house party.
Now, this wouldn't seem unreasonable in isolation. It was nothing that TSW didn't do 11 years later. Well, apart from the huge tombstone looming over the continuity announcer's shoulders like the spectre of death. But this was just a small part, of Southern's gruesome, dignity-free flame-out. The worst was yet to come, in the shape of Southern's last broadcast, and its goodbye from us. It turned out to be one of the most relentlessly bitter, supposedly celebratory programmes ever broadcast, despite the best efforts of the evening's compere, Christopher Robbie. To be fair to him and most of the other performers that day, they managed to hold on to most of their personal dignity throughout the increasingly psychotic proceedings. Essentially, the cyber leader here was given the unenviable job of hosting a near 3-hour televised tantrum on the part of the company directors, and he did a decent job of it. The show mostly consisted of clips from ballets, Glyndebourne operas, and festivals of contemporary dance, because Southern were a classy station for a cognoscenti laid low by a cabal of classless populist plebeians hell-bent on entertaining the working class. Surprisingly little mention was made of this.
Take a letter, Mr. Jones, ignore the telephone. You're a model secretary, you don't leave me in a mess.
Or this, which incidentally is the British remake of Groucho Marx's You Bet Your Life. Or this, an inexplicable variety show vehicle for their weatherman.
We have a bright and swinging opening to our programme this evening because Diane has chosen as her weather song, Don't Rain on My Parade.
Nope, Shakespeare, Elgar and documentaries about boats. Relentlessly highbrow stuff with absolutely no nookie bear. The centrepiece and the nadir of the whole thing was tapes of the final staff dinner. Sadly, no footage of this has ever surfaced, so I'll have to describe it based on what I could figure out. But as I understand it, the main crux of this part involved Southern's chief executive, C. David Wilson, drunk off his arse, as were most of his audience, and delivering an interminable and only intermittently coherent speech of extraordinary bile directed at the IBA. This apparently included extracts from the furious letter he dashed off to the IBA's chief executive, part of which went like this. We cannot believe that a decision of such importance, affecting the lives and futures of hundreds of people, can have been taken purely on assumptions that a new group of people looked as though they might provide a better service, as against a company whose regional performance is acknowledged across the network as second to none, and which has made many notable contributions to the network, and who, in the words of the IBA chairman, had not failed. The authority performed an act of arbitrary power based on a secret process of assessment exercised without the opportunity for defence, questioning or appeal. We believe it had already been decided that there had to be at least one supreme sacrifice, regardless of whom the replacement was to be. Using Lady Plowton's own words, we have been victims. This could be no proper way to conduct affairs of this importance. It surely defies every concept of natural justice. He concluded his rambling speech with a toast. To Southern Television, a fine company, a very fine company. The same staff dinner had also included a song welcoming the successor company, written and performed by latterly Sir Richard Stilgo, and again, astonishingly enough, broadcast across the region as part of the farewell broadcast. That this song ranks amongst the most childish and spiteful songs ever written is demonstrated by its title, a reference to the fact that the New Boys were currently based in a bunch of temporary Elliott huts in Southern's car park because Southern were refusing to sell them the studios until they were good and ready to leave. Here's a couple of verses.
We have bought a cabin TV and we can't believe our luck to have got the bit from Channel to North Sea. To be frank, we thought the best would have been to go for Westwood or Yorkshire or even ITV. We have bought a cabin TV and the southeast of our patch is top of our list of priorities. It will be all systems go in our Maidstone studio just as soon as we find out where Maidstone is.
If you really want to hear any more of that, here's the link. At least Wilson's diatribe was aimed at the IBA, not the blameless company due to replace them. All in all, it was the worst possible way for a TV station to go out. These days, when a channel dies, and it happens a lot in the digital age, they generally just cut to a holding slide reading goodbye and have done with it. You might find that a bit anticlimactic, but it's better than spending 3 hours bellowing down the lens about how it's all the viewer's fault for not watching enough. It all made for a rather depressing New Year in the South East, especially as Southern really didn't deserve to be remembered like this, if for no other reason than they provided John Pertwee with his second greatest role. The show went on and on well beyond midnight, finally coming to an end at 1:45, by which time Southern's contract had already expired, of course. And the conclusion to the show and the station was genuinely haunting.
Goodbye time. We said at the start we'd come to celebrate, and I think we had. We've enjoyed remembering, and I'm sure you won't forget. So, with a final farewell smile from those Southern people who've become, for many of you, true friends, it's goodbye from us.
There followed a 2-minute funeral march during which the faces of Southern were displayed in turn like the condemned facing a firing squad. The ones who are smiling already have jobs with the new franchisee. Although that's not a hard and fast rule. Arnold Wilson was among them, but that didn't stop him looking resignedly homicidal at the start there. Then, to the sound of the Southern Rhapsody reimagined as a requiem, the lights gradually went out. All that remained was the most haunting close-down in British television history. And that was it. No announcement, no God Save the Queen, no don't forget to switch off your set. The transition was abruptly murdered, and Southern were history. But surprisingly enough, the world continued to turn, and 8 3/4 hours later...
Good morning. It's New Year's Day 1982, and this is Television South, TVS, the new independent television company that's proud to serve both the south and southeast of England. To begin with, we bring in the new with, for the first time, our symbol, which will soon become very familiar.
Television South, TVS, launched with a brightly coloured ident and a brassy fanfare that stood in stark contrast to Southern's calculated false modesty. Right from the start, the former Portakabin TV was brash, exciting, ambitious and colourful. Well, mostly. And contrary to what C. David Wilson might have wanted to imply, the old Southern faces were not ritually slaughtered with a gigantic onyx dagger in order to power the studios with their blood. Well, look, how could you deny that face? The TVS rainbow-coloured leafy flowery thing on a black background remained for the first 5 years of the channel's existence, during which both Channel 4 and the BBC revolutionised television presentation with their spinnery, computery-generated who-ja-what's-name things. Apologies for the technical jargon. TVS, being the ambitious little scamps that they were, wanted to get in on all this pixelated action, so they refreshed their look in 1986 in this wise. It was basic, but that was an advantage. The 4-inspired Vogue for 3D objects flying through space had led to several idents featuring formerly 2D logos hovering around a surreal and alienating datascape to no obvious purpose. The simplicity of TVS's take spoke of an inherent confidence, as well it might have. The South and South East, already the richest part of the country, were now really beginning to reap the benefits of the new laissez-faire neoliberal economic outlook that Thatcher and company had brought to the country. In other words, they were raking it in. And their thoughts turned, as so many other companies would at the time, toward conquest. First Maidstone, then the world. And this is where it started to go wrong. IPA regulations prevented them from taking over any other franchises, in case we ended up with exactly what we've ended up with now. So instead, TVS went further afield. MTM Enterprises were, of course, the company set up by Mary Tyler Moore to make her eponymous show, and later became the vanity logo behind such genuine classics as Hill Street Blues, Saint Elsewhere, and both Bob Newhart sitcoms. Moore had already departed from the day-to-day running of the company, and her by then ex-husband buggered off to head NBC shortly after TVS began broadcasting, leaving an open goal for the little ITV franchisee that could to buy the relatively massive American company Lock, Stock and Barrel in 1988. Shortly after the acquisition, Mimsy the cat finally died at the age of 20. This might have been seen as a bad omen. Owing to their new status as an international media juggernaut, TVS was restructured as a branch of a new gargantuan parent company known as TVS Entertainment, and graced with a rather confusing logo that was disturbingly reminiscent of the rank insignia of a private in Nazi Germany. Because of its new status as a subsidiary to a massive looming beast, the station was rebranded with the deeply irritating and largely redundant name of TVS Television, as seen on the updated and slightly more American version of the ident. The easiest way to reconcile the name is to consider that TVS no longer stood for anything. Stands to reason this was a multinational now, its scope extending far beyond Dover and Southampton. TVS were just 3 random letters. This moody blue ident came along in 1989 in lieu of the ITV generic look, TVS being yet another company to reject it altogether. Perhaps because in their version of the ident, the triangular bit at the end, which is supposed to represent them specifically, had little or nothing to do with their actual on-screen identity. Although it is vaguely reminiscent of the TVS Entertainment logo. which, now I come to think of it, is actually triangular. Interesting thought, or it would be if it weren't so trivial. So with MTM now in the bag, TVS sat back and waited for the piles and piles of syndication dollars to start rolling in, shortly to be followed by a telephone call from Viacom begging for a merger. But as it turned out, they'd embraced the yuppie era a year or two too late. The late 80s financial crisis had left the US TV industry in a bad way. Meanwhile, back home, the distracted TVS were increasingly losing out on lucrative network slots for national broadcasting. Suddenly it dawned on them that, richest part of the country or not, the revenue from running an ITV franchise in the south of England alone wasn't enough to fund a global media empire. TVS entered the 90s effectively pissing money and having to axe 200 jobs in Maidstone and Northam to make up for it. Enter stage left the Broadcasting Act, and the blind auction franchise round it triggered. TVS knew their region was among the most desirable, wealthy but relatively minor, few network responsibilities and plenty of opportunity for profit. That's what had made them rich enough to buy Mary Tyler Moore, if not to hold on to her for very long. And in this franchise round, the one thing that mattered more than anything else, including competence, was money. TVS's strategy was bid high or die. To that end, they offered the newly minted ITC a frankly ridiculous £60 million. And something I may not have made clear enough is that these weren't one-off payments being negotiated in 1991, these were annual stipends. TVS were offering up £60 million a year, not on programming or broadcasting or development or technology, but just as a tithe to the regulatory body. The ITC's response? Chini Recon. The bloated offer triggered the equivalent of Final Jeopardy, the shadowy third criterion previously unspoken. TVS were not permitted to harm OCP employees. No, wait, it was that while having the highest bid was all well and good, you had to be sensible. If you couldn't realistically promise to keep up your payments, well... And with TVS visibly hemorrhaging coins all over the place as it was, the chances of them being able to spare 60 million quid every year looked extremely, even laughably, remote. They'd made a classic rookie poker error. Poorly bluffing on a bad hand. Bid high or die became bid high and die. Or put another way,
that's all, folks.
And so TVS's short life ended. It could be argued that they had even more right to be aggrieved than Southern. At least Southern lost in a fair fight. But ultimately, like their predecessors, they were the architects of their own downfall. And unlike their predecessors, they realised it, accepted it, and went out with dignity intact. Their final broadcast, Goodbye to All That, was presented by the legendary Fred Drainage alongside Westwood veteran Fern Britton, and contained not a trace of the bitterness that had accompanied their birth.
Yes, goodbye, have a great new year, and thanks for watching. Cheers!
Where Southern had assumed their viewers' sadness and gratitude, not to mention anger, TVS attempted to earn it. Where Southern mourned, TVS celebrated. And where Southern seemed to believe the viewers should be thanking them, TVS, with their very last image, thanked the viewers. The final humiliation came afterwards, when the now bereft TVS Entertainment finally sold itself off to colossal fundamentalist Dushima prick Pat Robertson. No doubt he used part of the fortune he'd earned investing in Liberian slave labour gold mines run by his good friend and brutal despot Charles Taylor. Or maybe it was the diamond mines in Zaire that he co-owned with Mobutu Sese Seko, and got 700 club viewers to fund by pretending they were transporting refugees and not pickaxes. Whatever, the hell with him. And I mean that literally. If there is one, he is certain to go to hell. Back to ITV. Taking over the south and southeast was a relatively demure company known as Meridian. The main movers behind them were Mills and Allen International, MAI, one of those capitalist odd-job companies with interests everywhere, from advertising billboards to opinion polling. Meridian was their first move into television, in a consortium with Select TV and, in an advisory capacity, Central. The latter two were also partially owned by Carlton. Feel free to bear this in mind. The most striking thing about the new station was its logo. Recalling the Art Deco feel of the original Southern ident, it was really quite odd for a TV station. Being far from immediate, it didn't quite have the same scroll-on-pencil case appeal as the Granada G Arrow. This is not to say it was bad, however, far from it. Some people sneered at it, true, but those were the same people who made almost every company in the world change their logo to a lowercase sans serif in sky blue at the turn of the century. Idiots, basically. The music is by the omnipotent David Dundas and came in a variety of arrangements. This one is apparently supposed to be reggae. Yeah man, we be jammin'. Never the most exciting of the ITV companies, remaining on the face of it relatively quiet and insular. In fact, it could be argued that the only thing brash about Meridian was its logo, which occasionally showed the influence of contemporary dance. They're mostly known in my house for creating Wizardora, the preschooler show which was equal parts charming and nightmarish. I really should have found this more unsettling than I did. They also produced Zap, the wordless live-action comic book, which again felt vaguely like a fever dream. Unfortunately, they were also instrumental in CITV dropping Reboot after the second series. Bastards. So that was Meridian's image: Art Deco, quietness and faintly troubling children's series. But behind the scenes, they were almost as ambitious as TVS, but better at it. They were helped, of course, by the Broadcasting Act making it legal for one company to own a controlling stake in more than one ITV franchise. And as soon as the traps were opened in 1994, they, or rather MAI, snatched up Anglia Television for no reason at all except that it was there. In 1996, MAI merged with United Newspapers, then owners of the Daily Express, to form UNM. Just go with it. At the same time, the ident was refreshed to become calmer, more purple, and slightly harder to make out. A couple of years later, it was refreshed again to become all yellow and misty, and pretty half-assed, to be honest. By now, in 1998, UNM had added HTV to their portfolio, and were in merger talks with Carlton, who, you'll remember, already have, through 6 degrees of separation, approximately 25% interest in Meridian. The merger was in talks for ages, and while every round of negotiations was extremely exciting, I simply don't have time to go into arse-aching detail about the whole process. Suffice to say that the merger came within a gnat's wing of actually taking place, only to collapse at the last minute when the Competition Commission said that the resulting mega company would have to sell Meridian. This was a jewel in UNM's crown. Uniting it with the jewel in Carlton's, the London franchise, was the whole point of the exercise. With that ruled out, UNM kicked Carlton out of bed and divested themselves of their television assets altogether, sending HTV, Anglia and Meridian lock, stock and barrel to Granada. And just in time too. Most of these episodes are going to have the same ending, I'm afraid, and it's not a particularly good one. It's especially hard on Meridian because their awesome detailed logo is reduced to a tiny red and yellow smear in the top third of the screen. But then they started the whole Matryoshka doll process by buying Anglia, so it's hard to feel too sorry for them. Plus there's the whole reboot thing. And of course, before long, ITV went fully generic, and the name Meridian now survives solely as a vestigial reminder, a piece of history that didn't get erased properly. Meridian, we hardly knew ye. Still, funny old region, the South. 3 different ITV stations. One died from lack of ambition, the other 2 killed themselves through over-ambition. It probably just goes to show something, but God alone knows what.
I wonder why they put the South so far south.